Gus Fring is one of the smartest fictional criminals ever written, but the real question is, could someone like him actually survive the real DEA? So we will be comparing him from the DEA from 2008 or earlier, following the timeline of the shows Breaking Bad and Better Call Saul. From looking into his cartel connections and his distribution system to answer one question: would he be able to evade the DEA as long as he did, or would he be in handcuffs? Level 1. Distribution Network versus DEA. Gus Fring's entire operation was structured to look like an ordinary food service supply chain, the kind you'd see across the Southwest every day, and that was his biggest advantage. Everything starts with his trucking system. The Los Pollos Hermanos delivery trucks were fully legitimate commercial vehicles, registered, insured, and maintained the same way any restaurant chain would keep their fleet. In Better Call Saul and later in Breaking Bad, we repeatedly see these trucks being waved through checkpoints and inspections with zero suspicion. The drivers looked clean, drove normally, and acted like people on a regular job. But the real brilliance was the concealment method. Gus didn't use secret compartments or hollowed-out panels. He used fried chicken batter, completely sealed buckets that looked identical to every other container in the shipment. To anyone doing a random check, it was just food inventory. Labels matched, invoices matched, and everything had the same serial codes and restaurant documentation that real suppliers use. The only difference was meth inside of a select number of buckets, weighed, bagged, and submerged into the batter mixture. To the human eye, or even to most scanners, it just looked like tubs of ingredients. It also helped mask the chemical smell, making it extremely difficult for canine dogs to detect anything. And to make sure his own people didn't accidentally mix these buckets with normal stock, Gus would use a system that only the highest level members of the operation knew about. We see this attention to detail in Breaking Bad when the drug-containing buckets were marked using an invisible stamp only visible under a very specific type of ultraviolet light. Gus always made sure that the people touching the high-risk containers were the ones trained to recognize them. Drivers never knew which buckets had drugs. The industrial laundry was also another perfect piece of cover. When Gus first brought Walt there to reveal the super lab underneath, the place looked exactly like what it claimed to be.
The laundry upstairs, I've owned it for years. It receives large chemical deliveries on a weekly basis, detergents and such. There is nothing suspicious about it.
The noise from the huge machines, the steam from the presses, and the constant movement of workers created a busy environment where nothing unusual stood out. To any outsider, it was just a massive commercial cleaning facility running at full capacity, and that was the key to hiding everything that was happening underneath the laundry. The DEA in 2008 would have struggled against this kind of system. Back then, most investigators relied heavily on physical surveillance. Agents had to follow vehicles manually, sit on warehouses for hours, and hope that someone made a mistake. GPS trackers, they existed, but attaching them required warrants and physical access to the target vehicle. Then wiretaps were useful, but Gus didn't conduct sensitive conversations on the phone, and his subordinates rarely discussed anything incriminating because they genuinely didn't know the bigger picture. But informants only work when low-level workers have something to reveal. So in Gus's case, many warehouse workers were aware that drugs were moving through the system, but they never were told where the product came from, where it was going, or who was ultimately in charge. Even seizure-based investigations would have been difficult. The border and federal databases in 2008 weren't fully automated, meaning that a truck flagged once didn't automatically trigger alerts everywhere. Without drones or modern automated tracking tools, following a commercial vehicle for hundreds of miles would have required enormous manpower. But every system still has weak points. Truck drivers have historically been the easiest targets in real drug cases. Even if one driver was stopped under the wrong circumstances, or if one load was seized due to a routine inspection, the DEA could begin putting pressure on the weakest link. Unusual traffic at the laundry or warehouse could also raise suspicion over time, especially if agents documented repeated late-night activity or unexplainable patterns. And so, I'll have to give this one to Gustavo, since his network was built to look legitimate from every angle, and the DEA's tools in '08 weren't good enough to find anything through suspicion alone. But even the cleanest distribution system falls apart if someone inside decides to talk, and that's exactly what the DEA relies on the most. At level 2, we're looking at whether Gus's control over his people could hold up in the real world. Level 2, operational discipline versus DEA informant strategy. Gus Fring's reputation for discipline was one of the things that made him so dangerous. He was calm, collected, handsome in a nerdy kind of way, and almost mechanically controlled, never letting emotion dictate his actions. Outbursts, reckless decisions, or public displays of violence were completely foreign to him. Whenever a problem arose, whether it was a threat from the cartel or internal issues with his employees, he addressed it quietly and efficiently. Loose ends were eliminated in ways that left no traces, usually by trusted enforcers like Mike or Victor or Tyrus, who carried out operations cleanly without attracting attention. A prime example is how Mike handled Howard Hamlin's murder. He removed personal items like his wedding ring and wallet to prevent identification and staged his car several states away next to the ocean to create the impression that Howard had drowned himself. Even when the high-stakes conflicts emerged, Gus maintained his distance. He never personally handled drugs, and communication was tightly controlled. One example is when he orders the hit on Bolsa. He uses a burner phone to make the call, and once the conversation ends, we see him immediately dispose of it in a bin outside of Los Pollos Hermanos early 2000s style. God, I miss flip phones. But this shows how seriously he protected himself from traceable tech. And even within the organization, compartmentalization was key. Drivers, warehouse staff, and most restaurant employees only knew the tasks they needed to complete, while managers focused on legal operations and bookkeeping, completely insulated from the criminal side of the business. This separation minimized risk and limited the potential for leaks. That same logic extended to how Gus sourced materials for the super lab. On the surface, ordering a large quantity of chemicals made sense because he owned an industrial laundry. Cleaning solvents, degreasers, and industrial supplies were normal for a business of that size. However, in the real world, chemicals closely related to meth production, especially precursors like methylamine, are heavily tracked, logged, and accounted for, particularly in large quantities. Even for someone as careful as Gus, acquiring a barrel of methylamine would be extremely difficult without drawing attention. If Gus's chemical orders didn't match what other commercial laundries of similar size were buying, it could raise serious red flags. Regulators, suppliers, investigators could notice unusual purchasing patterns long before the DEA ever saw the lab itself. And how can we forget that high-level cartel associates like Hector Salamanca could create unpredictable situations? In the scene when Hector comes to Los Pollos Hermanos, he essentially holds the restaurant hostage while waiting for Gus to show up.
I want you all to go home now.
While most employees remain unaware of the criminal side of the operation, exposure to figures like Hector creates potential recognition risks. Additionally, street-level dealers and other low-level cartel operatives sometimes knew Gus's position within the organization. We see this in the scene when Jesse meets with Gus and the two dealers responsible for Combo's murder.
I understand that you have a problem with two of my employees. It is true that they killed one of your associates. It is possible that they acted rashly. But on the other hand, there was provocation. The man was selling on their territory.
These overlaps, they really do matter, guys, because once multiple layers of people are aware that Gus is more than just a businessman, even though Mike's management of security reinforced discipline and made sure that risky interactions were contained before they could escalate, the DEA's strategy in 2008 revolved around exploiting these exact human weaknesses. Informants were their primary tool, often targeting low-level employees, truck drivers, warehouse staff, unity offers, witness protection, or undercover operations. We have plenty of real-world examples that showcase the effectiveness of this approach. In the Cali cartel, an accountant's cooperation revealed the full hierarchy, while Operation Accelerator relied on flipping Sonola drivers to map distribution networks. Even Gulf cartel warehouse workers were pressured into providing actionable intelligence after seizures of product and equipment. The DEA's philosophy was simple and effective. Find the weakest link, flip them, and then use that information to map the entire structure. Every organization has human elements, and even the most loyal employees or subcontractors can be influenced under the right circumstances. Gus's discipline and structure made him far more secure than most real-world traffickers, since he avoided unnecessary risk, executed precise operations, and he maintained control over every aspect of his empire. He's a control freak. But over time, even a figure as careful as Gustavo Fring would face significant pressure from real-world informant strategies. And once the DEA found that one weak link, the secrecy he built around his network would begin to collapse. Winner, DEA. But now that we're done with operations, let's explore whether his public image could outsmart the DEA, shall we? Level 3, Public Image versus DEA Identification. So, Gus Fring's public persona was almost impossible to question, right? On the surface, he was the picture of success, middle-class business owner, the family-friendly face behind Los Pollos Hermanos, donating to schools, local charities, and even police programs. Dude is a philanthropic G. Philanthropic? I don't know how to pronounce that word. But anyway, his relationship with Asac Merkett, the head of the DEA in the show, gave him an additional layer of credibility, making him appear as a trusted community figure. This is shown clearly when Gus shows up at the hospital after Hank is shot and brings yummy, delicious food for the agents present there. On the surface, it looks like a simple gesture of support, reinforcing his image as a kind, thoughtful, and non-threatening member of the community. But Gus's real objective had nothing to do with goodwill. Moments later, while the DEA's attention was fixed on Hank in the hospital, Gus used the distraction to give Mike access to Lionel Salamanca. Mike injected him with a lethal dosage, ensuring that he would never be able to speak or cooperate with law enforcement.
What's going on? What's happening?
His polite behavior and daily routines made him blend seamlessly into ordinary life, giving anyone observing from the outside no reason to suspect any criminal activity. He maintained a low profile, showing up at the restaurants in a calm, professional manner, supervising staff without drawing attention, and keeping interactions friendly and predictable. By doing this, he reinforced the illusion that his business was exactly what it appeared to be, a thriving but legitimate fast food chain. Customers, employees, and even law enforcement had little reason to question him. But even the most careful facade has its weak points, and for Gus, it was his minimal Chilean documentation and mysterious background. In the show, during the investigation into Gail's murder, Hank interrogates him after discovering Gus's fingerprints at Gail Bedeker's apartment. Hank immediately notices the gap in Gus's history as there was no official records to verify his Chilean background, no consistent trace of his arrival in the US, and virtually nothing tying him to the life he claims to have lived.
General Pinochet's government was guilty of a great many sins. First and foremost were its human rights abuses. But it was also notoriously unreliable at keeping records.
This is important to mention because if a seasoned DEA agent like Hank notices these gaps, a real-world investigator with access to databases, border records, and background checks could easily connect the dots. These gaps, they don't scream criminal, but they do create questions that could be pursued further if the DEA had any reason to start digging. Gus also reinforced his invisibility through consistency in behavior. Unlike other criminals who might flaunt wealth or behave erratically, Gus stayed calculated in everything he did. He lived modestly, never flaunted wealth, and maintained routines that made him appear like any other hardworking business owner. For the DEA in 2008, someone like Gus wouldn't be targeted without a reason. Agents needed an actual reason, like a tip, a suspicious pattern, or observable irregularities to open investigation. But we can't overlook the fact that even without those factors, missing documentation, unexplained background gaps, or unusual behaviors could put someone on their radar. Ultimately, Gus's public identity is airtight as long as nothing triggers investigation. His calm behavior, charitable presence, and ordinary routines make him almost invisible. But the show proves that even a subtle clue, like Hank noticing his undocumented background, could start the process of closer examination. In the real world, that kind of opening is all the DEA needs to begin unraveling the threads of a carefully maintained empire. Still, for day-to-day life and casual observation, Gus remains untouchable. His careful planning, polished public image, and ability to blend into the community gives him a clear advantage, keeping him off of the DEA's radar until something concrete forces a deeper look. Winner? Gus. Next, we'll look at how Gus moves his money and whether his financial tricks could really fool the DEA. Level 4. Financial Laundering versus DEA Financial Crimes Division. Gus Fring ran his finances with the same precision he applied to every part of his empire. He carefully blended legitimate business with illegal activity, making the flow of money appear completely normal. At the heart of this strategy were his several legitimate ventures, which provided steady cash flow while giving his empire an unshakable layer of credibility. Starting with Los Pollos Hermanos, a chain of 14 restaurants spread across the American Southwest, and these locations generated a steady, high-volume stream of cash that Gus could use to integrate proceeds from meth sales.
I am delighted to report that the last quarter Los Pollos Hermanos revenues have increased 8.3%.
By reporting this money as daily sales, he made it nearly impossible for law enforcement to separate legal revenue from illegal gains. The same trucks used for money delivery also carried hidden shipments of meth from Mexico to distribution points in the United States. This dual-purpose system created a flow of cash and product that looked entirely ordinary, masking the true scale of his operation. Then, another key piece of Gus's financial strategy was Lavanderia Brillante, his industrial laundry. The business's massive scale, constant activity, and high utility usage provided cover for the underground meth superlab operating beneath it. Beyond providing a hiding place for the lab itself, the laundry offered another high-volume business through which Gus could circulate illicit funds. Large deposits, utility bills, and staff salaries all had plausible explanations to tie to the legitimate operations, giving the DEA very little reason to suspect wrongdoing. Gus also leveraged Madrigal Electromotive, the German conglomerate that owned Los Pollos Hermanos, to further complicate the money trail. By operating under a multinational corporate umbrella, he could use trade-based methods like misinvoicing and layered transactions to move money internationally without raising a question. In several scenes, including interactions with lovely Lydia Rodart Quayle, we see the careful attention to shipping and supply logistics, illustrating how financial operations were intertwined with everyday business activity. But in Better Call Saul, we get a glimpse of just how fragile this layer actually was. Peter Schuler, the Madrigal executive overseeing Gus's operations, openly complains that millions have already been spent covering tracks and that he is dangerously close to being exposed.
He's concerned about the money.
Concerned? 4,800,000 euros. It's a miracle I haven't been caught. Last year, the auditors came this close.
Now, let's step back for a second and look at his life as a whole. This was a man who arrived in the United States with no visible past or public history, yet within a few years he owned a rapidly expanding restaurant chain, an industrial laundry facility, a trucking fleet, and multiple warehouses. On the outside, it looked like the story of a hardworking immigrant who built an empire from nothing. But in the real world, that's the kind of rise that makes financial investigators ask questions. Because when someone's wealth appears out of nowhere and grows that fast, it creates suspicion before anyone even looks at the books. And Gustavo understood that risk. That's why his businesses were engineered to look perfect. But despite the layers of sophistication, the DEA in 2008 had tools to detect irregular financial activity, though it required patience and cooperation across agencies. The Bank Secrecy Act forces banks to report any deposit over $10,000. They also report repeated structured deposits when someone tries to stay under $10,000 limit by breaking up money into smaller chunks. If a restaurant suddenly reports a spike in revenue that doesn't match customer traffic, supply orders, payroll, or utilities, the system, it flags it. That's how real cartel cases get exposed. Investigators compare fuel usage of delivery trucks with the number of deliveries reported. They compare supply orders with actual customer turnout. In money laundering cases, if a business claims it made $5 million in a year, but the amount of chicken they bought could only realistically support $3 million in sales, investigators know something is off. For someone like the Chicken Man, this meant that although his businesses and corporate structure could hide drug money for years, over time, patterns would raise questions. Excessive cash flow, unexpected supply usage, and utility consumption that didn't match reported operations would eventually trigger investigations, especially when combined with cross-agency data analyses. The DEA could track these trends, compare them to legitimate benchmarks, and identify discrepancies that point to illicit activity. Ultimately, Gus's financial system gives him years of invisibility, but it isn't perfect. But folks, the real test is how well Gus can stay ahead when the DEA uses tech, data, and procedure instead of just bank records, and this brings us to our next level. Level 5, Intelligence and Foresight versus DEA. Gus Fring's greatest advantage was his ability to think far ahead. He planned years into the future while staying calm in the moment, and this mix of long-term strategy and instant adaptability is what kept him ahead of everyone chasing him. One of the clearest examples of this was when he figured out that Nacho swapped Hector's pills. Most people in Gus's position would have killed Nacho immediately. Instead, Gus saw the situation as an opportunity, and from that moment forward, he used him as a source of information, keeping him alive because his access to the Salamancas made him more useful as an informant than as a corpse.
I know what you've done. The Salamancas, they do not. Do you understand what I'm saying? From now on, you are mine.
This kind of galaxy brain thinking showed up again with the way he handled the cousins. They were the cartel's most feared hitmen, and Gus understood that their loyalty made them both useful and predictable. First, he pointed them towards a rival gang, letting them wipe out an entire group of dealers so he could expand his territory without risking any of his own people.
Get some rest. You have more to do.
And when they eventually became a threat to his operation, he redirected their anger. Instead of letting them go after Walt, he quietly turned them towards Hank.
They're coming to kill you. They're approaching your car. You have 1 minute.
You see, Gus didn't care about the outcome. If Hank died, the DEA would treat it as cartel retaliation. If Hank survived, the cartel would lose 2 elite enforcers. Either way, Gus benefited. His most extreme display of foresight, though, was the way he wiped out the cartel. He pretended to respect Don Eladio for years, giving gifts, building trust, and acting like a loyal partner.
La pasa sentado en su alberca, asoleándose.
I am satisfied with the current arrangement.
But in reality, he was playing 4D chess, planning a complete takeover. When the moment finally came, he brought a poisoned bottle of tequila to the meeting at Eladio's place. He took the first drink to show it was safe, waited for everyone else to join in, and then stepped away to vomit the poison out before it could kill him. Meanwhile, Don Eladio and the rest of the top cartel members kept drinking. One by one, they collapsed around the pool and died, leaving Gus in full control with no one left to challenge him.
Don Eladio está muerto. Sus capos están muertos. Ustedes no tienen a nadie más por quien pelear. Llenen sus bolsillos o váyanse en paz.
On top of that, Gus avoided traceable communications in a time when the DEA depended on relatively primitive technology. Phones were used by law enforcement for call records and dialed numbers, but in the early 2000s, there was no modern GPS tracking tied to devices, no cheap phones, and no integrated digital data linking across agencies. Sensitive conversations happened face-to-face, often in controlled locations like the industrial laundry or the super lab, where hidden surveillance or informants were least likely. But it wasn't like the DEA didn't have any tools in 2008. One of their most effective methods was the pen register. It didn't record voices or content, it only captured the numbers being dialed from a phone and the time each call was made. Honestly, when it comes to intelligence gathering, Gus's long-term planning and tight operational security allows him to stay ahead of the investigative curve. The DEA, those nerds, they could map networks, follow phones, flip informants, and seize labs, but they couldn't proactively identify someone with no digital footprint, no careless associates, and no traceable communications in this era. Winner? Gus. Level 6. Counter-surveillance and security versus DEA. Gus Fring's biggest advantage was how he controlled what anyone could see. Law enforcement investigations often start with noticing patterns, who goes where, when, and how often. Gus built his operations so that every movement could be monitored, managed, and most importantly, remain hidden from prying eyes. We see this the most clearly in his restaurants. Gus often sits inside of his office with a screen showing live feeds from cameras covering every corner of Los Pollos Hermanos and key areas of his facilities. From this vantage point, he monitors employees, deliveries, and even casual visitors in real time. His super lab under the laundry provides an even clearer example of this layered security. Access was strictly limited, and only a few people knew the exact route, the hidden elevator, the laundry stacks, and the entry sequence. Even when Hank convinced Gomez to visit the laundry, Gus's super lab remained hidden. They brought in a drug-sniffing dog while Jesse was told to stop cooking down in the lab. The dog missed the hidden lab entrance because the advanced air filtration eliminated chemical odors, leaving the DEA empty-handed. Then, beyond physical barriers, Gus controlled internal observation with ruthless precision. When Victor was seen at Gail's apartment moments after Jesse murdered him, Gus immediately killed him in the lab in an awesome scene to ensure there were no loose ends and that no one could connect the dots.
We'll just pick up right where we left off.
This level of control created natural blind spots for anyone, including law enforcement trying to map the operation. In the real world, the DEA doesn't rely on cameras or immediate surveillance. While Gus could watch his employees in real time, federal investigations work over a longer period, tracking suspects through phone records, bank transactions, utility bills, and travel patterns. Unlike in the show, where Gus could react instantly to a single problem, the DEA uses methods that are often invisible to the target, making it hard for even someone as careful as Gustavo Fring to see every move. DEA agents often combine human observation with technical monitoring, watch key associates over time, and collect evidence from everyday activities. The DEA also monitors multiple sites at the same time. They can check truck routes, deliveries, and employee schedules across the region. This gives them insight that no single operator could completely hide. So guys, in the end, Gus's counter-surveillance made him almost untouchable in the moment, but real-world DEA methods work over time. Winner, DEA over time. When we look at real-life figures like Joaquin El Chapo Guzman or Pablo Escobar, a clear pattern emerges. No matter how tight their networks or how strictly they ran their operations, law enforcement eventually brought them down using informants, surveillance, and careful pattern tracking. Gus Fring might be smarter than these cartel leaders, but he would still struggle under the sustained pressure of the full DEA. Now, folks, let me tell you, this is just what I think. If you think Gus could actually outsmart the DEA and keep running his empire while selling his yummy, delicious chicken, drop a comment down below. And if you enjoyed this video, check out our other video on smartest characters in Breaking Bad. Thanks for watching, have a good one, and bye-bye!